My name is James Kenley. I serve as the executive director of the Vail Symposium. And on behalf of Dale Mosier, who's our board chair, and our entire board of directors, thank you for spending your evening with us tonight. We are a nonprofit organization. Ticket sales make up about 10% of our operating revenue. Donors at every level make our programming possible in our community. And I'd like to thank a few organizations and individuals who made tonight possible. Our presenting sponsors are the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. The Conversations on Controversial Issues, moderated by Clay Jenkinson series, is generously underwritten by Alpine Bank, Nancy and Stephen Dowdle. I'll get to the phones in just a minute. Carol and Pete Feistman, Lainey and Merv Lappin, Jeannie and Dale Mosier, and Mary Pat and Keith Rapp. Special thanks to the Grand Hyatt Vail for their support tonight as well. Would you please give them all a round of applause? Shifting our attention to tonight, the Conversations on Controversial Issues, moderated by Clay Jenkinson series, is designed to go deeper than the headlines and provide more nuance than the news networks on complex topics. I'm sure you'll all agree that the topic tonight is a complex one. We'll be talking about gun violence in America. Our moderator is Clay Jenkinson, a nationally recognized historian, author, and public humanities scholar with special interest in Thomas Jefferson and the American Republic. How many of you have seen Clay with the Vail Symposium before? Love that. Okay, please tell your friends. There's a lot more Clay coming. Clay writes books. He portrays a number of historical characters, including Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Meriwether Lewis. He appears in documentary films, including the new one by Ken Burns about Benjamin Franklin. He edits the National Lewis and Clark quarterly journal, We Proceeded On. He hosts the nationally syndicated public radio program and podcast, Listening to America. This is rebranded as from the Thomas Jefferson Hour. And he hosts and moderates Humanities Symposia and serves as an editor-at-large for the distinguished online journal governing.com. He's a very bored guy. He's just hanging out in North Dakota. Got nothing happening. Clay is the winner of many awards, including the National Humanities Medal, which is the highest honor bestowed by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Before I turn it over to Clay, I'd like to recognize our creative collaborator on the program this evening, Wendy Rudolph. Wendy, where are you? Yeah. And I'd like to acknowledge here at the Eagle River Presbyterian Church, our friend Jeff Fleming is our AV master. And there's a lot of technical gymnastics that hopefully will just seamlessly fade into the background. And Jeff has been an incredible help for us with these programs. So Jeff, thank you. Okay, now to introduce our panelists and lead our discussion. Please welcome Clay to the stage.
Evening, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. I'm so glad that you're here. And believe me, there will be 30 minutes of Q&A, so be thinking of questions that you want to make. Maybe avoid speechifying. That's our job. But we are very eager to get your perspective as we go on. So first of all, our two guests, come on up and take your chairs, and I'll introduce them here in a moment. This is I love coming here. Why? Because it's Vail, but also because I'm from North Dakota. So, where the highest peak in North Dakota is White Butte, 3,506 feet. I want you to know that I have made the ascent 4 or 5 times. I usually establish a base camp at about 2,000. And after 4 or 5 days, the oxygen really begins to... So, as a North Dakotan, when they call and say, come to Vail, I'm right outside city limits. But also in the audience tonight are some of my oldest and dearest friends. And I won't mention everybody, but I'll mention one. My friend Jim Burak is here. When I was married and living in Boulder, my wife Etta, who's a distinguished lawyer out in Kansas, was a first-year law student, and in one of the lines that they go through on the first orientation, she met this guy named Jim Burak, and they became extremely close friends. And Jim and I have been close, and so his family. And Jim joined the Marines after going to law school. And so, you know, when you come back from base camp, or whatever that is, training, you know, his head was shaved, and my wife said to me, "Isn't there something you can do for Jim so he'll feel," because, you know, it's Boulder, so everyone's hair is down around their ankles. Isn't there something you can do for Jim? And I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go shave my head, and then when he comes in the house, he'll feel that he has a true friend. So I went to a barber who almost refused to do it because it's Boulder. So, you know, go to Longmont. Go to Colorado Springs, you know. But he finally did it, and then Jim came over and came in through the door, and he looked at me and said, "What's the deal? You got head lice or something?" Yeah. So after all that, to be, you know, dissed with contempt by a Marine, you don't dare mouth off, you know, because you know what they've learned. So it's really great to see him, and if I had told Etta, who lives out in Sharon Springs, Kansas, which is right on the other side of the border, she would have driven out because she has no interest in seeing me, although we're close friends, but great interest in seeing Jim. So I'm so glad to be here. I just want to do a quick poll of the audience, and you don't have to raise your hand, but I hope you will. So how many of you own a firearm? How many of you own more than one firearm? How many of you have never owned a firearm? How many of you will never own a firearm? How many of you believe that reasonable gun regulation is a good idea? Do any of you believe, no, the Second Amendment is an absolute? None here, but we should go to rifle. I was in rifle the other day and I wanted to go to shooters, but it's gone. And I had two companions, and I said, when we get in there and the server comes, be super polite. Don't say anything, don't delay them, don't say anything that could upset them if you want to walk out of here alive. But it's gone now, so there you are. How many of you believe that the AR-15 should be outlawed? You're watching this, guys, right? Amazing, all right. How many of you know somebody who has been close to an act of gun violence? Interesting. Very interesting. Now, let me introduce our guests here. On my immediate right, David Yamane is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Wake Forest in North Carolina. His BA is from Berkeley, and he has a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So welcome to you. Josh Horwitz is at Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. His BA is from the University of Michigan, and he has his JD from George Washington University. Welcome them, please. And I'll be saying next slide, so I apologize for that. So next slide, please.
Welcome to Indianapolis.
You fight like hell for freedom.
This is the one after the title. Bear with us. We got this. One behind. One behind. There you go. All right. So, you know, after the Watts riots and the campus unrest in the 1960s, there was the Kerner Commission, and we stepped back and agonized as a nation about what should we do about this. And you all remember that after the 9/11 catastrophe, there was a commission that looked into this, and after the Kennedy assassination, there was the Warren Commission. When things reach a sort of a catastrophic state in the United States, we tend to step back and ask ourselves some really hard questions about who we are and what we value and what are our fundamental problems and how we might start not only thinking about them, but perhaps resolving them. This may be such a time. We all know that now in this year, there have already been more acts of mass gun violence, depending on how you define that term, than the number of days in the calendar year 2023. 15 years ago, I remember a commentator saying, there have been 4 acts of mass violence this year. How will we ever survive this? And now, as you know, they are so frequent, depending on how you define them, that they've departed from page 1 and departed from the top of the news. They have been normalized to a certain degree. And the question we want to ask tonight is, where do we go from here? And we will certainly get to that. But it does seem to me, as we approach the 250th birthday of the United States in 2026, and you tell me if I'm wrong, we appear to be in a state of national disintegration on a number of fronts. And one indication of the dis-ease or disintegration of America is the gun mayhem. Keep in mind, however, that most gun violence is not mass shootings. Thus far this year, there have been about 320 deaths by gun violence in mass shootings. If you double that, it's June, so let's say 800 to 1,000 this year, if this trend continues. That's still about 1/50th of the number of gun deaths in the United States. So most gun deaths are not mass shootings. Mass shootings tend to sensationalize this discussion, and our 2 distinguished guests are here to help sort of bring it down to a more comprehensive, more holistic, more balanced, I think, approach to this. So let me just start with I want to show 2 quick clips, 2 quick video clips. The first one is of the NRA conference in Indianapolis 2023. Hang on.
God does not allow it.
Are we okay, or should I move on? James? Sorry? We'll move on. I take it that means the second one too, which is video clip 2, is not available at the moment? Who knew? A technical glitch. All right, so, that's, yeah. All right. Please, oh please. Just give me the discussion roadmap if you can. That's slide 6.
Welcome to Indianapolis.
Well, let's watch the Indianapolis.
Indianapolis.
You fight like
More volume.
for freedom, and you get more of it.
More
One
volume.
member at a time, one vote at a time. You show up. You stand on principle. You fight, and you win. So what do you say? Let's fight like hell for freedom, and let's get more of it.
Thank you for being here in the Hoosier State, and thank you for your strong and unwavering stand for freedom.
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of a people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
I'm thrilled to be back with the hardworking, God-fearing, card-carrying patriots of the NRA. It's really a tremendous force for freedom. That's what it is, and I'm very proud to be here.
I think the American people could learn a thing or two from the NRA. This is not a group of people who give up their God-given constitutional rights willingly.
And now, if it works, a clip of President Obama after the shooting.
When Americans are killed in mine disasters, we work to make mines safer. When Americans are killed in floods and hurricanes, we make communities safer. When roads are unsafe, we fix them to reduce auto fatalities. We have seatbelt laws because we know it saves lives. So the notion that gun violence is somehow different, that our freedom and our Constitution prohibits any modest regulation of how we use a deadly weapon, when there are law-abiding gun owners all across the country who could hunt and protect their families and do everything they do under such regulations. Doesn't make sense.
That was after a mass shooting in Oregon during the Obama administration, and he's speaking from the White House. Now let's go to slide 6, if we may. Here are the things we're going to try to get to here. I'm going to try to hold us to time discipline. It's not easy because this is a very, very complex subject, as you know. But number one, does the U.S. have a gun problem or problems? Number two, what's the best way to start thinking about this? You know, a problem like this is so involved. There are so many factors, there are so many variables that you have to wonder what's the right entry, where's the right portal to start to make sense of this? And there are some portals that aren't necessarily the best way in. So our two distinguished guests will help sort that out. Number three, is America an especially violent country? Number four, the significance of the Second Amendment, and we will give that some time. And then number five, what should we do and where should we start? So if you would then go please to slide 10. 10, the mass shooting slide. Next one. There we are. This is a slide of the mass shootings so far as of May 8th in 2023, and you see that they concentrate along the West Coast. That's Portland, San Francisco Bay Area, I think at Fresno or Bakersfield, LA and San Diego, down along the Gulf Coast, particularly Gulf of Mexico, Florida, the traditional Confederacy, and the eastern seaboard. I'm glad to say North Dakota, none. And the Mountain West is surprisingly clear so far this year, but 202 as of May 8th, 2023. Next slide, please. This is a Christmas card by Representative Thomas Massey. On the left, it's somebody's somewhat snarky comment on it, a meme. But there you see Representative Massey and his family holding some pretty serious weapons. A Christmas card. I don't think that would have happened in 1968. Sort of where we are, that we've normalized this to the point where this is not that unusual. And of course, the person writing about it says, nice family Christmas pic to post after 4 children were just murdered in their school. But I suppose as long as they're someone else's kids, right? Next slide. And this is Lauren Boebert from the 3rd District here in Colorado with her children and others. And no spare ammo for you. So we've reached the point where this is an acceptable Christmas card in some zip codes. Next slide, please. Just to remind us of where we are here, it's Colorado. We all remember Columbine, which was really the first of a modern wave, of a recent wave of these school shootings. April 20th, 1999, 15 dead, 24 injured. Next. Aurora, the theater, the movie theater in Aurora, July 20th, 2012, 10 dead, 70 injured. And what makes this photograph so chilling to me is you see that the CSI people have shown the trajectory by way of these arrows. And just imagine that moment on July 20th, 2012, people going to see a film and this level of mayhem occurring. And one more recently, Boulder. I lived 1 mile from this grocery store when I was in Boulder for those 3 years, shopped there. And this was March 22nd, 2021, 10 killed, 2 injured. That's Colorado. And these are our neighbors here. Next slide, please. Just a few cartoons and then we turn to you. This one, the elephant is, of course, in this case, a Republican. You should have a gun. The idea that the answer to school shootings is that everybody, all the staff, all the teachers, the principals, the janitors should all have guns. You should have a gun, and the teacher saying we don't even have pencils. And then the homework is take cover. Next. This one shows shootings: Columbine, Virginia Tech, Aurora, Newtown, Charleston, San Bernardino, Orlando, and Las Vegas. And on each of those graves, now is not the time to discuss gun control. We'll come back to that next. Again, the elephant in the room pounding his fist on the podium. And the other person is either Christ or a Christ stand-in. Lay down thy sword and shield. And the Republican angry man says, this wacko is going to get us all killed. Next. This is my favorite, actually. This comes after the Dodd's decision last year, and the wife says, relax, I hid the contraceptive pills in the gun. So that's pretty good satire, you have to admit. And look at the depiction of the sheriff. Unfair, but funny. Next. And this one speaks for itself, but instead of bring me you're tired, you're poor, the tsunami is of assault-style weapons, overwhelming the liberty, the symbol of liberty in the United States. And then one more. This is another really powerful one. The last. We had 30 or 40 of these, we whittled it down to these. Uncle Sam saying, nope, I can't see any light at the end of the tunnel. But we're not stopping there, so let's go to the next slide. All right, the nature of the problem. David, you're a sociologist. Help us get started here. Contextualize this set of statistics and so on that I've been suggesting here.
Yeah, so, well, I'd like to say I'm excited to be here, but I'm not excited to have to address the issue of gun violence. But it is a pleasure to be here with you to have a conversation about the issue. And the one cartoon in the courtroom said it was a gun debate, and I don't really like that formulation because debates have winners and losers. Conversations are geared toward understanding, and I think that's what we're all hoping for here, is that we come away with a better understanding of the complexity of the issue, the way we got into it, and possibly ways out. And I know I'm going to learn from being here also. So, I'm a sociologist of guns and gun culture. I actually am not a specialist in gun violence, and my unique position, I think, within the field of gun studies is that I don't come about the study of guns primarily from the perspective of crime, deviance, and epidemiology. And so when I look at this issue of gun violence, I see it in this much broader context of at least 75 million individuals in the United States own probably somewhere around 400 million guns. And guns are not a singular reality in this country. Guns are a very complex reality. Many guns and gun owners are innocuous. Some guns and gun owners are a positive force or represent something virtuous. And some guns and gun owners are problematic. And so when we are talking about this issue, we should recognize that we're looking at the small minority of guns and gun owners that are problematic. And when we're looking at mass violence, we're looking at the extremes. And oftentimes when we talk about guns and gun violence, we see the extremes, right? We see as you were suggesting, from my cold dead hands on the one hand, or why can't we just get rid of all guns on the other hand? And it becomes like a Chinese finger lock, right? With each side pulling on the other, and most of us who are in the middle just kind of being stuck there. Another thing I'd note is you're not a representative sample of the US population. About a third of Americans own firearms. About a third of Americans, which I saw was the majority of people here, do not currently own firearms and would never own firearms. But there's also a third of Americans who I call gun curious who don't currently own firearms but aren't opposed to that possibility in the future. So 2/3 of Americans either personally own or would consider owning firearms. And so again, this is, I think, the broad social context within which we should start to approach the nature of the problem, which is the problem is the exception, not the rule, for guns and gun owners in America.
And so let me just follow up on that just with 2 quick points. So you saw the poll here. That doesn't represent Colorado necessarily either. If we went to Rifle or to Montrose, there would be a very different poll result. And so this is a pretty unusual community, I would say, in that regard. And the other point you made, I think, really needs to be reinforced, which is that if, let's say there are 400 million guns, and nobody knows for sure, but it's a lot of guns, more than the number of people in the country. Most people have never fired a weapon in anger. Most people are responsible, take care of their guns, store them properly. Most people are respectful of each other. So when we talk about gun violence, so there are about 48,000 gun deaths in the United States per annum. That's a very, very, very small subset of the responsible gun owners that exist across this country, right?
That's right. And a majority of those deaths are people harming themselves. You know, they're not even people harming other people with firearms.
Now,
2/3 of gun deaths are suicide,
Okay.
which isn't to diminish the significance of that. But again, if we think about the typical gun, it's not being used against another human being in anger or outrage or crime.
And so if we could just go to slide 7 for a moment. There you are. So this is 2021. You see suicides, 54% of the gun deaths in this country were then by suicide, and you're saying it's possibly even higher now. Homicide, 43%, law enforcement, 1%, and I'll think of the coverage that tends to get in the sensationalization, accidental or undetermined, 2%. So then if you could go back to the slide on the nature of the problem. So, Josh, yes. You've been in the trenches on this, in the arena on this for decades.
Yes, I have.
So reflect on the nature of the problem.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And David and Clay, it's a pleasure to be up here with both of you. And I hope we have a really interesting, and we learned something all from each other tonight. And obviously the Vail Symposium is amazing to have us all here. And it's a great venue to talk about some of the problem that we're facing. And the nature of the problem is that David's exactly right, but when this occurs, when there's gun violence, when someone dies, the harm caused is so great. We can't go take, there's no pill to unravel this. You can't go, there's the harm that we see is so high. And when I work with families who've lost someone from gun violence, the pain of that never goes away. It's life-changing. And the expense of gun violence, even though it is a rare occurrence for gun owners, the expense is also a lot. But then think about how often it occurs. Every 8 hours in Colorado, someone dies by gun violence, right? So even though there's maybe 400 million guns, we still see an immense type of harm caused by it. So when we think about the nature of the problem, and I think about other harms, one of the reasons that I've spent so much time with public health, the public health model, is because I think that's a way to understand the problem and understand the solutions. I was involved in an advocacy organization for over 3 decades, and I'm recently now at Johns Hopkins. It's an evolution in my career towards a way of thinking about gun violence and what the problem looks like. So one thing to understand is that it's a complex problem. So we just saw that some of it's suicide, some of it's homicide. Within homicide, you have different breakdowns. You have domestic violence, you have community violence, you have arguments that turn deadly, you have people injuring and killing each other under the influence of alcohol, which is a driver of violence. All of these things lead to that number, but may require separate solutions. So when we think about the nature of the problem, we're talking about different problems, but susceptible to the tools, I think, that we have in the public health model. In the same way that we've taken on diseases and automobile crashes, think about automobiles. It's not exactly analogous, but we've made roads safer. We've made cars safer. We've increased the requirements for drivers. All these pieces go to a solution. And gun violence is no different. We're not going to, solve this with one bill, one intervention, one community program. It's going to take many of those. And much of what we will probably discuss today is how do you prioritize that? What should go first? How do you get to agreement on some of these things? So the nature of the problem is complex, but it's susceptible to the tools that we know about. And that's the way I approach the issue.
So Congress recently passed what's being called a bipartisan gun bill.
Safer Communities Act, yes.
So characterize what actually happened in that bill.
Well, that bill, was in the wake of a number of mass shootings in Uvalde and Buffalo, so it addressed some of those things. So one of the things that I work a lot on is extreme risk protection orders, or red flag laws. People know what those are? Some of you not. They're temporary protective orders that allow friends or family members to remove firearms. So there's funding to implement those laws. So what does that mean for Colorado? There will be, I don't know exactly, but millions of dollars to help Colorado implement their new extreme risk protection order. For the first time in the Safer Communities Act, there's a crime established, a federal crime of gun trafficking. It clamps down on who can sell firearms, which is important, get a federal license to sell firearms, which is important because federally licensed dealers must do a background check. Okay, so make that a broader pool, more background checks get done. It enlarges the types of people who are prohibited from owning a firearm because of domestic violence offenses. Okay, so it also creates a new an extended background check for people in the age group 18 to 20. It also provides money for community mental health funding and to make schools safer. And actually, I can't believe I remembered all those things, but that's a good chunk of what that bill does.
So these are good things.
They are good things. Yeah, I mean, depending where you sit, I think most of them are pretty strong and evidence supported, and will make a difference if we give it time and we keep funding these things. You can't snap your fingers and make this go away overnight, even if with great interventions.
Let me just check. Can everyone hear well enough? Good. So David, we said that mass shootings are a very small percentage of all the gun deaths in the United States per annum. But of course, there is a special something about that because let's say that there's an act of domestic violence and it leads to the death in a household. We all deplore that, of course, and we would like to find ways to make that less probable. But when there's a mass shooting in a theater or at a sports event or something, it has a terrorizing effect on the population, and people say, maybe I won't go to that concert in Las Vegas, maybe I won't go to the mall, because who knows what can happen. It probably won't, but it could, and it does. So talk a little bit about the outsized terrorizing effect of mass shootings.
Yeah, well, I think you said it exactly right, is that many mass shootings, certainly not all mass shootings, but many mass shootings are terroristic in their effect. They're also terroristic in their intention. If someone is, committing mass murder in a synagogue or in a church, in a school, these things are designed to frighten people beyond the immediate victims, and they're succeeding quite well in that. And it becomes extremely hard for us in the face of terrorism to figure out how should we proceed in society, because, for example, we want to send our kids to school without having to worry about whether they're going to be shot that day. But it can also sort of overwhelm some of our sense of perspective in that, you know, every time I allowed my son to drive his car by himself to school as a 16 or 17-year-old, he was in much more risk of being injured or killed than he was of having someone come into his school, right? And so, you know, I think those everyday risks that we face, and here we could extend to the everyday risks of homicide and suicide by gun, you know, tend to get lost in our, I think, appropriate concern over mass shootings, but sometimes excessive fear. You know, I think that we have a culture of fear in America that's driven by the media, it's driven by advocacy organizations, it's driven by politicians, and it really cuts both ways. You know, it cuts toward gun owners and it cuts away from gun owners.
So I want to go to video clip 3 if we can. We wanted to have somebody from here, from Eagle County, talk, a rancher, an alpaca rancher, named Cass Galloway, talk a little bit about her own use of guns in their own operation. And so if you could play clip 3. Yes.
We have hunting rifles, so 30-06, 270s, for basic big game hunting. We have pistols, we have shotguns, we are a well-armed militia. We have generational guns. And a lot of the ranchers in Eagle County have generational guns that have been handed down from great-grandfathers to great-grandchildren to, you know, basically family heirlooms. We have 87 alpacas. We have coyotes and mountain lions. We have bears. And the resident animals that have been in the area for years are usually no problem. But we happen to be the quote-unquote wilderness in Eagle County. And when they have nuisance bears, they end up being a nuisance for us. And if they're killing my animals, we take action and have been given permission by Game and Fish to protect our animals.
So while we're at it, because you mentioned school children and sending them and wondering whether they're going to come home at night, if you don't mind, could we play video clip 6, also of Cass Galloway, talking about how young people are responding to the drills that they're constantly getting about the possibility of a school shooting. 6.
They're terrified. They're terrified. I had that group of kids come in here for kids' knittings, and they were chanting what comes over the loudspeaker in school when they're having an armed shooter drill. And it's just, it repeats in their brains. And the one little girl wanted to know who gets to hide in the cupboards. How do we get to decide who goes in there? She said, because that's the best place to hide. And in a class of 20, how do we, and she said it totally naively, she just wanted to know, you know, how do we decide who goes in there?
It's chilling, isn't it? And you know, we think of the effect of COVID on a generation of young people that were at home, going to school at home, pressure on single parents, pressure on both parents, and maybe a lost generation in that sense, and colleges too. Then you think of the living with the idea that the drill in my time was the atomic drill. Some of you will remember, duck and cover. The drill of our time is there's a mass shooting going on down the hall. So let's go to slide 24, if we may. Okay, sociologist. America has always had, we were born in violence, in the middle of the road with the Civil War, more than 600,000 dead, the largest mayhem in the history of America by far. the frontier here. I was just at the Colorado History Center the other day. Have you seen the Sand Creek Massacre exhibit there? World class. You must go. It's told from the point of view of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. It was the largest single deadly moment in Colorado history in November rather, of 1864. So violence is deeply woven, baked into the American experiment, and you might even say to the American character. And you might even go so far as to say that we've had a national love affair with violence. You don't need to spend much time watching cable television to see the cop shows, shootings all the time, video games, film, cartoons, comic books, graphic novels, that this is a country, and we're not alone in this, I know, but we have had a national love affair, obsession with violence. So do you think that we are especially violent?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we're especially violent. I think that it's also the case that we're living probably in the least violent time in all of American history, which, is a hard thing to say because we do still experience so much violence, and then especially in comparison to some of our peer nations. And I think that's where we get a sense of the fact that our level of violence is so much greater. But I can say that if you take all of American homicide and you remove all of the homicides by guns, we still have a higher homicide rate than England, right, for all of their homicides.
So wait a minute, if there were no guns in America, our homicide rate is per capita larger than that of Great Britain.
That's right, yeah. So, I think that there is a high level of violence in our history, in our present, and, that could have something to do with the fact that we, as the United States, have been trying to do something that no other country in the world has tried to do, which is to bring together several 100 million people from different cultural backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, to include a high level of economic inequality. If you tried to get all of Europe to come under a common government, they would be at war right now, right? We are having, disputes, sometimes uncivil disputes. We're not at war with each other in the United States. And so, it's, for me, it's always a both and. It's oftentimes we want to take the gun issue and make it either or. But, yes, the U.S. is a particularly violent place, but no, we're, not off the charts in terms of American history, or even, if we went back in human history, we'd be amazed that we made it this far.
So I want to ask Josh the same question, but before, I just want to say that I did a lecture on American violence a number of years ago, and I started by reading Huckleberry Finn, and I counted the number of violent moments in Huckleberry Finn. It's staggeringly high. You don't see until you put the lens on. You put that lens on, and you go, oh my goodness, the violence in that novel. And then I looked at all the James Bond films from Goldfinger through today, and you remember them, some of you, Thunderball and Goldfinger. Back then the violence was, chop suey, and the person would fall down, as in Star Trek, and it was all, stylized and not particularly graphic. If you watch sort of the Daniel Craig Bond movies now, it's incredible violence. I mean, you wonder how the body doubles even survive some of the stunts that they have to do. And so in that period, we've gone from a kind of almost comic book depiction of violence and to a graphic level of violence that's, for some of us, too excruciating even to watch. And this does seem to be deepening as a part of our popular culture, at least. But I know you've said that, say in Japan, the video culture is extremely violent, and yet their homicide rates are low.
Well, and if you look at the number of people who play first-person shooter games, these are some of the most popular video games anywhere. They're extraordinarily graphic. They use all of the high-tech weaponry, but almost nobody who plays those video games or who watches Bond movies or any of these things, becomes a monster. Right, and so, again, some of the things that may seem obvious contributors are not so obvious when we look at it sort of systematically.
Hard to draw the lines. 25, please, if you would give me slide 25. There you are. So, Josh,
Yeah.
are we a particularly violent people?
Well, we are particularly violent when it comes to guns. So we may have a higher rate than England, but we have an exponentially higher rate in gun violence. And I think the answer here is thinking, well, let's start first. Again, going back to the idea that when gun violence affects individual families and communities, it's devastating. And thinking about guns, we have about 75% of homicides in America are by firearms. If we could make a dent in that, if we could reduce that by 10 or 20 or 30%, you're talking about thousands of lives every year. And so, yes, we may be a more violent country, but we are a much more gun violent country. With guns, we're much more violent. Can we address that issue? I don't know that we can address the violence overall, but can we address the lethality? That's the big issue with firearms, lethality. Can we maybe that violence would have occurred, maybe it wouldn't, but with firearms, it's lethal. So think about, even with suicide, what they call the case fatality rate for suicide with a firearm is 85 to 90%. With pills, it's about 2 or 3%. Changing the means that we conduct violence with saves lives. So we may be more violent, but because we have this strong, easy access to firearms, the lethality is so devastating in this country. So the question that I hope we get to is not necessarily are we more violent and how do we stop that, but how do we make our violence less lethal?
Indeed. Next slide, please, 26. Just so you get a chance to look at that. So, if you're older than 50, this is how you grew up, right? This was America's pop culture in the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s until the spaghetti
Can I just
westerns.
quickly follow up on this?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely,
I think,
of course.
Again, this thinking the both and, I think that we can address that issue of the lethality of firearms and also address the underlying cause. And I know you agree with that.
I do.
But we can reduce suicidality. We can reduce levels of community violence. And if we can also reduce the lethality issue, I think we have problems that all modern nations have. They can become exacerbated when you add a firearm into that problematic situation. So I think we need to address both, and I'm sure we'll talk about that.
So let's go to 27. All right, so we've all seen this. You saw President Obama talking, and I remember once during his administration, he was giving the talk you give after an incident like this in a shopping mall somewhere, and he said, how many times am I going to give this speech? How many times am I going to give this speech? And the country briefly wrings its hands and says something has to be done, and then a month later, it has slipped away. So let's just go to the next slide. And these are and I want you to comment on these when I've got them all up here, but these are the usual responses at that moment. Number one, this is not the time to have this debate. This is a time to pray, to commiserate, but this is not the time.
You want me to jump in on that one?
Sure.
Yeah, so after Virginia Tech shooting, which happened in my home state, I remember I needed a few days to sort of process, and I felt at the time, which was much earlier in my career, that I should really give a little bit of respect and time for the families to grieve and bury their loved ones. Well, it turns out I've become extremely close with the families from Virginia Tech. They're some of my closest friends. And they're like, why did you wait? What were you thinking? Now that I go back, please, it's the time when something like this happens. So I learned from people in my own community who had suffered from that, saying, you honor our loved ones who died by speaking about this contemporaneously in that time. So for me, that I learned the hard way. When my friends, my new friends, which were, no one wants to be part of that club, right, of a survivor club, but they're there, and I become friendly with many of them, and I support them, and they all say, you honor our loved ones by speaking when the cameras are on, when it matters, and when you can influence the discussion.
So I want you to comment on this next one. Number two, all we need to do is enforce the existing laws. We don't need any new laws. We got more laws maybe than we need. if we would just enforce the laws that are already on the books, we could solve a lot of these problems.
Well, David says this a lot, yes, and. So we need to enforce the existing laws. Absolutely. There are domestic violence prohibitions that don't get enforced. There are new extreme risk protection order laws here that some of the sheriffs will not use. That's no good. We have tools out there to be effective. For instance, when people fail a background check, oftentimes there's no follow-up. So we do have laws that can be better enforced. And in our field of public health, implementation is a big field now. How do you implement laws that are on the books? How do you implement programs? So yes, we can do a better job enforcing the laws. And in some, we have a dichotomy between states. Some states have better laws than others. But there are different laws and new laws that we need to round out what we have to create a regulatory regime that will save more lives. Do you want me to jump into that?
Sure.
Okay, so number one is making sure that before you can buy a firearm, you get a license. That includes fingerprints, background checks, and visit with law enforcement. Those states that have that have seen a very effective drop in suicide and homicide.
All right, that's number one. So how many of you are okay with that? You need a license to buy a firearm. Okay, number two.
Number two actually goes to the existing laws, which is either every state should have an extreme risk law, some people call them red flag laws, and they should be enforced. And at our center, we spend a lot of time working with jurisdictions to learn how to enforce those laws. So firearm removal is number two.
But, I mean, there are privacy concerns about this, but how many of you are okay with red flag laws? Okay, number three.
Safe storage. Everybody should agree, every gun owner should agree that you should lock your firearms. Unloaded, not necessarily, but unloaded in a safe for two reasons. One is, maybe even more than two reasons, prevent your gun from being stolen. Number two, it will protect, if you have suicidal ideation or someone in your house has that, even if they know the code, it takes some time to get the gun. And better yet, if they don't know the code or this combination, they cannot get the gun. So that's very important. So you have, gun trafficking and gun sales, and you have protection for the home. So locking your guns and safe storage laws. And there's a lot of debate about, should I have a trigger lock? Should I have a cable lock? Let's make it simple. Keep your guns unloaded in a safe.
How many are okay with that? Okay, number four.
Maybe we'll get a little more controversial here. Number four is that we should limit the public carrying of firearms. And the reason we should do that is that there's two reasons. One is that the empirical research shows that it increases crime and violence. So that's number one. The other thing is, at least where I live, and probably here as well, guns are used as a tool of intimidation to prevent people from exercising their democratic rights to vote and to work in the legislature. So often you see people with firearms at polling places, outside of legislators, and the clear intent is to intimidate people from exercising their rights. I can go into some stories about that, but I really believe that from public safety perspective and a democracy perspective, we should limit the public carrying, and especially the open carrying of firearms. And this is not an exhaustive list, but
this is four, so how many are okay with that? Limit public carry. And how many states have open carry now?
I don't know.
It's a number of them.
I live in an open carry state, so,
In your state is?
Yes, it's an open carry state.
Right. So, but there are states that have open carry, but it's a small number.
Oh, no. Many states have open carry.
And in many states, open carry has never been illegal. In the state of North Carolina, you've always been able to openly carry a firearm.
Right. Do you want to add a fifth?
Yeah, and this is my top five, but not exhaustive, is we should invest in community violence intervention programs like Ceasefire, Cure Violence, Safe Streets. We're really, at our center, trying to understand the best of those programs and what the evidence shows. But we're here where you're looking at the people who are driving violence and trying to get them services that they need, therapy that they need, what's called credible messengers in the community, talking to people who are most likely to commit violence. Those programs in many states many locations have been effective. So if you ask me my top five, those are my top five.
Community violence intervention programs. Okay. All right. So James and Joe, this is out of sequence, but would you put up video number 4 because it comes straight out of your list. This is John Oliver interviewing a man named Philip Van Cleve, who was advocating for the Virginia Citizens Defense League. And so let's watch this short clip. It's video clip number 4.
Yesterday, Americans watched in shock as even watered-down gun legislation died on the floor of the Senate. But that is exactly where it belongs, according to gun lobbyists like Philip Van Cleve of the Virginia Citizens Defense League.
The Second Amendment, is sacrosanct.
You hold up this sign whenever I make a suggestion that you think is infringing upon your Second Amendment rights, okay?
Okay.
Assault weapons ban. Boom, there it is. Increased background checks. Really?
Yes.
Just for background checks?
We don't do background checks for the First Amendment.
Okay, so let's just try this one.
Okay.
Nice and easy.
Sure.
A mandatory 1-hour waiting period if you buy a gun.
Why are you mandatory?
Are you kidding me?
Unless I could see a reason. No. I can't think of anything that I support. Because at the end of the day, none of it works.
Exactly. Gun control does not work. What if, hypothetically speaking, what if gun control could work? Which obviously it can't, so we know that it won't, so that's not a problem. But what if it could, due to that time that it did?
Okay, when was that?
Australia. Yes, Australia. In 1996, a Conservative Prime Minister, John Howard, instituted sweeping gun control laws following a mass shooting that shocked the nation. So should we be learning from this effective example? Of course not.
So there's the old adage, where you stand depends upon where you sit. You made your 5. And I would think that the vast majority of people in this room agreed with your 5 suggestions. Now, the devil's in the details and so on, but if we were in my state of North Dakota, outside of the 2 university towns, or if we were in Rifle, there would have been blowback to your 5 suggestions. Sure. The vote would have been very, very different, and some of those red Second Amendment signs would have gone up. So you acknowledge that you're in a very special place here.
Well, I would say that, I would say that the items I just mentioned are very popular across the country in all states, and among gun owners and non-gunners, among Republicans and among Democrats. And so, yes, there are pockets of people who don't want to have to get a license before they purchase a firearm, or maybe don't want red flag laws in their jurisdiction, but most people do. And so I think that, I actually think Tennessee is a good example, where we had an act of mass violence. Nashville, Tennessee, you had an act of mass violence, and even in a very red state, people were shocked when they did local polling and they say, we need an extreme risk or red flag law here. We need background checks here. And the governor, who really doesn't want to do this, is actually forced to call a special session because average citizens want this. So I actually think on the policy front, the ones that I'm talking about, we have wide agreement among Americans, among a big part of Americans, that these are acceptable. And what I like about what I mentioned is that there's evidence to back them up. That's why they're part of my top 5, because we have public health evidence to support that.
All right, let's go to number 3, and David, you too, if you want to comment. Number 3, you've heard this, of course, guns don't kill people. People kill people. Guns can't climb out of the safe and go into the street and shoot somebody. It takes somebody pulling that trigger, so it's not about guns.
Well, I think it's both, right? I mean, I think there are firearms. We've had an unprecedented amount of firearm sales recently. We have people who are with more guns in their homes who are not storing them safely, and we're seeing a rise in the last 2 years in violence. So I do think there's a gun component in this. But when I see that people kill people, or hear that, which I do all the time, I want to know, how do we identify those people who are actually at risk? And I've spent a lot of my time focusing on the public health data about who's at risk, and I want the gun lobby to come back to me and say, well, if people kill people, how do we know who's if that's our remedy, which I think actually it is our remedy, how do we identify folks? How do we limit the gun prohibition to times when they're actually dangerous? And how do we move forward with a risk-based approach to stopping gun violence, which is the people kill people, right? We're not just going to, I assume we don't want to just let that happen. So if that's the construct, then we need to focus on who can have a firearm more than what kind of firearm they can have.
Who are these people?
Yeah,
So,
can I jump in?
please,
Because, I
certainly.
think that it's easy for us to all, watch John Oliver and laugh and, have our confirmation bias, kick in. And let me just say something about my background. 40 years of my life, I lived in a blue bubble that started in the San Francisco Bay Area and followed me through sociology into some of the most liberal places in the country. And for the last 12 years, I've been deeply immersed in American gun culture. So I have a foot in two different worlds, and oftentimes find myself in a position to translate one world to the other. And the framing of this resistance to reform and all of these cliches really doesn't capture, I think, in a fair way, the way many gun owners see things, which isn't that this is resistance to reform constructed in a particular way, right? It's not resistance to how can we address the issue of gun violence. And so there are perfectly rational and civil responses to some of the things that Josh suggested that I don't think should just be laughed out of the room. And I think that the alpaca farmer who's your neighbor is much more representative of gun owners than Philip Van Cleve is. And so I think that really needs to be part of our effort to work together toward reform, because if Josh frames things in certain ways, I have to push back. If he frames them in other ways, I'm like, we're on the same page. Let me just say something about safe storage. There are many Americans who own firearms for self-defense and for home defense. And you may not agree with that. That may not be the way that you choose to defend your home and your family, right? You may have a dog, you may have a security system and cameras, and you live in a very safe community, or you live in a gated community, right? Some people feel that the way that they should defend their home and family is with a firearm, and if that is your principal objective, then you can't simply say, I'm going to lock my gun here in a safe and unloaded with ammunition stored, locked separately, which is the way that many safe storage laws are formulated, right? So if someone says, I do not believe in that safe storage law, they're not saying I don't believe in safe storage, they're saying I don't believe in the way that that's framed in particular. And responsible gun owners should store their firearms in ways that people who are not authorized to access those firearms cannot access them. And I think that's a point of agreement. How we should get there, we can differ on, but it doesn't mean that gun owners are resistant to using storage, safe storage, and unauthorized access prevention from reducing violence. And just one other thing, the issue of carry of firearms. Open carry and concealed carry are two pretty different phenomena. Open carry has, in many of the states in which it exists, has never been against the law. It was always seen that if someone was an honorable person and they were carrying a weapon, they would let everybody else know that they are carrying that weapon. Now, it's become a sort of political symbol to protest at the Capitol building or wherever, open carrying a rifle. I think that's a very different animal than the typical formulation of how open carry has been part of American history. And the issue of more permissive permitting schemes, so you have sort of no permitting, you have very strict permitting, we call it may issue, you have to have established that you have a good cause or you're a good moral character to get a permit, and you have more liberal carry regimes. Now, we can maybe differ on how clear the evidence is on that, but if we accept that there is some evidence that states that have more permissive carry laws see increases in crime, it's not the people who are carrying firearms with permits who are committing that crime. Would you agree?
I don't think I would agree with that.
Okay, well then you can we'll bracket that for the moment. I don't believe that the dramatic increase in crime, well, I wouldn't even say it's a dramatic, the modest increase in crime in more permissive carry states is attributable to people who are legally carrying firearms, who we know actually have lower rates of criminality than, in some cases, even the police. There's data out of Texas that says that. But what it may do is put more guns just generally into circulation. So, for example, gun theft is a huge way that guns move from the legal into the illegal market and then become crime guns.
That I completely agree with.
So one thing that I think liberalized carry laws can do is create more opportunities for theft to occur. We were talking about this at breakfast, that people, if they're carrying a gun, they're going into a place where they can't carry the gun, so they take it out, they put it in their glove box, they forget about it, they go home, they go to bed, and then someone breaks in their car, steal the gun. So, I think that this is an issue with permissive carry laws. It's not an issue with people who are committing crimes but are doing sort of dumb and irresponsible things that are leading to more crime.
I would say the only reason I disagree with you is because I'm not 100% sure of the mechanism. There's a number of potential mechanisms, so that's.
So I accept your view that this can caricature the resistance, but I also will tell you that I hear these arguments every day of my life, and not just in North Dakota, but from a wide range of people in the country, and certainly from media. And I do believe that these are arguments that are routinely used, including by responsible gun owners. I just want to carry on with them.
Yeah, they're used, but they're deeper than the sniggering version that we're getting.
You think this is sniggering?
Well, I heard people snigger when Philip...
Who sniggered?
All you had to do was say John Oliver and everybody sniggered.
Well, that's appropriate. Let's go to number 4. We need more good guys with guns. That, the answer to this is to arm everybody, and the things like the Aurora shooting might not have happened if there had been a person in the second row who had a gun. So we won't need to comment, but let me just go through them and then we can wrap it up. 5, it's a slippery slope of the liberal agenda. If they get any one of your 5, then it's only a matter of time before they want to confiscate everybody's guns. You've all heard this. Number 6, have you read the Bill of Rights? We're going to come to the Second Amendment here in a moment. Number 7, hey, how about we start with media, with video games, before we go after guns? And then finally, number 8, the first thing Hitler did was lock up all the guns. So there's no one in this room who hasn't heard these. You've all heard them. So do a little wrap up. I get your point about sniggering, and no one will dare now. But this is part of the discourse.
Yeah. If you think back to those Christmas cards with people
Laura Boebert
carrying
and so on.
ARs, the AR-15 has unfortunately become the symbol of guns, which are a wedge now in our polarized political system. And this is extremely unfortunate. And the reason why people do what they do is precisely to get the kind of response they get. They are trying to trigger the libs, and it's working. So that's why they do it. They're playing to their base, and they're trying to, play against the people that they see as their political enemies. But this issue of being political enemies is not a one-way street that runs from Trumpville, towards Enlightenment Town. Like, it goes both ways, that people who are on the liberal side are as polarized towards their opposition as Republicans are towards liberals. And my view is that we need to sort of take that gun as a symbol of something more and remove it from the equation so that we can get down to those places where we really do agree, which is that we want less gun violence. And here are ways that we can do it, and to get beyond the sloganeering that happens on both sides, right? I mean, I constantly see protect kids, not guns, right? Nobody who is a gun owner does not want to protect kids, right? And if you are approaching the issue from that perspective, you are immediately alienating people who could be your, if not political allies, at least, you know, allies of convenience to get something like this bipartisan Safer Communities Act passed. So, you know, depolarizing things by not just sort of adopting the slogans on both sides, right? I think, you know, good guys with guns is one of the, you know, the dumbest formulations that has come up in recent years, and I've argued publicly against using that formulation, right? In the same way, you know, I would argue against using formulations like protect kids, not guns. Neither
Josh,
one is helpful.
Quickly, do you want to comment on this at all?
Well, I think, you know, we need more good guys with guns. Generally, you know, I think one of the pieces of this is that just having a gun per se without any training, experience, practice isn't going to be particularly helpful. So generally the idea of, for instance, arming teachers with very little training is a bad idea, because teachers should teach. They shouldn't be worried about where their gun is. They should be focused on these things. If we decide we need more people armed in a school or at a place of work or worship, they should be people who are well-trained, badged, if you will, you know, and ability to understand when not to shoot. A lot of times that's a big issue, when not to shoot. And also, and you've seen in some of these mass shootings that there are people with firearms there, even law enforcement there, but because of the element of surprise aren't able or aren't willing to stop these things. So it's not an either or question, but I just generally think the idea that we need more guns in public or more guns into the general populace to stop shootings, I think is not a wise approach.
Thank you. So we're soon to get to Q&A, so we've got 15 minutes here, and
great.
I saved this next one. This is 33. I wanted to keep this until the end so we don't let it overwhelm us here. The Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And then go to 36, please. I hope this is not a caricature, but so these are things to think about. Number one, the intentions of Madison and the founders. What's the hole they were trying to patch? What was the thing they were trying to get at with the Second Amendment? And you know there's a very lively debate about that. Number two, the interpretation of the courts through the course of American history. And today, I mean, we're right on last year at this time, the Bruin decision and other decisions likely to come. Number three, whatever the Constitution is said to mean, or the courts make of it, there is the understanding of the American people of what this means. And then finally, to the extent that this serves as like a trump card, a barrier to discussion about amelioration of this problem. So I want each of you to give in the shortest possible compass what you think the original intent of the Second Amendment was.
I think it was to protect the state's ability to control their militia and the ability to have people of states choosing in that militia free from federal intervention.
So if that's true, do I have a right to have 20 rifles in eastern Montana?
I think it depends the way your state regulates firearms and regulates the militia.
What's your reading of the Second Amendment's original intent?
Yeah. So here I want to say something that I think we would benefit, again, thinking about our conversations about firearms, if more people took this option, which is, I'd say, I don't know. I am not a legal scholar. I don't study the Constitution. I'm not a historian. So the way I think about the Second Amendment is that prior to the passage of the Constitution of the United States, that gun ownership was extremely common in the United States. And so it's part of American history, and I believe that whatever the founders were trying to do in constructing the Constitution, they recognized that common American citizens would own firearms, and maybe even, you know, had a right to own firearms. And the other thing I'd say, and I think we should spend some time talking about this, is the opinion about what the Second Amendment means. The opinion that really matters is the 9 people sitting on the Supreme Court right now. And what I think, or Josh thinks, or Clay thinks, you know, is dwarfs in comparison to what those 9 people think. And what they think has changed quite a bit over American history.
Now, my liberal friends say that, if you go back to 33, my liberal friends say it's about a militia. It's not about private ownership of guns. It's about a militia, and it means to be well regulated with officers, and that this was intended to prevent a standing army and a permanent military establishment, and that's the meaning of this, and it should not be construed as a license for people to have arsenals. And my conservative friends say that whole militia stuff is just boilerplate. It's really a guarantee of my right to have weapons. This goes back to your point of the polarization, that this one sentence can be used by either extreme on this argument in a way that demeans the other interpretation and insists that there is one and only one.
Well, here's where, I think debates are consequential, because whoever wins the debate over what those words mean, has a huge influence on all of the rest of us. So, I think the meaning of the Second Amendment is something that the courts and the Supreme Court decide, and the rest of us live with that.
Josh, talking about the Supreme Court, where do you think they are in this? The Bruen decision was volatile and much debated.
Well, do people know what the Bruen decision is?
Please tell us.
So, in 2008, the Supreme Court for the first time found an individual right to have a gun in the home. The Bruen decision...
2008, you have an individual right to have a gun in your home.
For the first time, the court ruled that.
In American history, first time, Heller.
United States versus Heller.
Right.
That's not right. DC versus Heller.
Right.
In the Bruen case, NYSERPA, which is the New York Rifle and Pistol Association, found that right extends outside of the home, so that they struck down part of New York's concealed carry law permitting system. But that's really not the impactful part of the decision. The impactful part of the decision is that they looked, the court actually created somewhat of a novel way to look at how we protect rights. Typically, you would look in what's called levels of scrutiny. I'm sorry, but is this narrowly tailored to a government purpose? Look at the First Amendment, things like that. There's some reasonable regulation. The Bruen decision actually says, if it's covered by the Second Amendment, then you have to look to the history somewhere around 1787 to see if there were those types of restrictions. And so when you think about 1787, it's a pretty different country. You think about domestic violence prohibitions that we have today, they certainly didn't exist in 1787. So this idea of text, history, and tradition that they use to limit New York State's law, that's really what the big fight is going to be about. And there's going to be, the lower courts are now in sort of disarray about how to interpret that, with decisions coming out all over the place.
So you said that was then and this is now. Just point of fact, and I want to ask you about this, a high-tech weapon in the age of Jefferson was a musket that took 40 or so seconds to reload. I've reloaded them. It's a complex thing. A high-tech weapon today can, I don't know how many bullets it can fire, but a lot very quickly, and they can be reloaded almost instantly. Does this represent, in terms of American law and norms, a difference of degree or kind? In other words, does the technology require us to rethink this because the Founding Fathers could not have imagined a 9mm pistol?
Well, I don't think they couldn't have imagined that. But I actually think if we could get to the two things, we could get to the original and back to the original intent, we wouldn't have to change it. But if this is in fact a mandate that we can only have the types of regulation that existed in 1787, I think we need to change something. I hope that the court will revisit the Bruen ruling and put some guardrails on. In fact, there's an opportunity to do that with the case right now, and I'm really hoping they accept this case to sort of put the Second Amendment back into a context that we can actually understand and make sense. Because right now, again, it's chaos, and I hope they do something. Or if they don't, then you have the question of like, do you have to revisit the Second Amendment? Is that even possible? I don't think it is. So it's problematic.
So Bruen was 1 year ago.
1 year ago.
Precisely, and you, when watching your Apple Watch today or your phone, in case the cert is granted for this.
I was looking, I didn't see it, but my phone wasn't working that well either.
So the day after the abortion decision, Bruen came, got less attention because of course, the incredible sensational volatility of the Dobbs decision, but that was a year ago, and that has created some chaos in the lower courts trying to figure out, oh, now what? And so you're hoping that the court will grant cert and revisit this and clarify.
Yeah, there's a case out of Texas where the court struck down the prohibition on people having firearms with domestic violence protection orders. The Fifth Circuit upheld that decision, and now there's a cert petition by the Department of Justice to overturn the Fifth Circuit and reinstate the firearm prohibition for people under a domestic violence protective order.
Can I say, I think the fear, and it's a somewhat justifiable fear of the consequence of this text history tradition standard, is that it's going to make it harder to uphold gun regulations, right? And so there's chaos, but the fear is that it's going to lead to overturning many gun regulations that we've come to accept.
Yes, and that's a very good point. I mean, under the former decision under Heller, most of the laws that I think are important were upheld. Now you have courts going divergent. Some courts finding that they're unconstitutional, some finding that they are. And you're right, the ultimate, what I'm worried about is that the Supreme Court sides with the courts who find these things are unconstitutional.
And what was the vote in Bruen?
6-3.
6-3, so that's where things are shaking out generally.
But it was a complicated decision. There was multiple concurring opinions.
Concurring and dissenting and so on.
Yeah.
And this was an originalist decision, the idea of context of 1787 and so on and so forth, or partially originalist.
I just want to say, like, the question in terms of the technology, lethality of firearms, it's accepted that firearms that are dangerous and unusual can be prohibited from ownership. And I think every firearm is dangerous. If they weren't dangerous, they wouldn't be useful to the purposes that people put them to. So what we're talking about is firearms that are unusually dangerous. And so it's accepted that firearms that are unusually dangerous can be regulated. And the question then becomes, will the Supreme Court see AR-15 style weapons as being unusually dangerous? And that is a question that's going to be very difficult to establish using the text history and tradition standard, because there is no good history.
There's no analogy.
Yeah, there's no analogous laws to this. We can't necessarily get inside those people's minds in ways we would want to.
So unusually dangerous, AR-15, how many regard that as an unusually dangerous weapon? Go ahead.
I'd just say they're dangerous. Unusually not unusual, I think they're dangerous.
But you can't ban firearms just on the basis of their dangerousness, and then you'd have to ban every firearm.
But no, I agree with that.
Okay.
I just want to, I hope this doesn't seem like a irrational point, but the AR-15 in Uvalde, for example, so damaged the children that some of them were unrecognizable and their heads were literally blown off. That sounds unusually dangerous to me. That just sounds automatically unusually dangerous. Is that wrong?
The AR-15 is capable of killing a lot of people quickly. There's a continuum of weapons, and at some point you just have, I think you have to draw the line about what you're willing to have among civilians. It's designed as a military weapon. We could talk about what the features are, but it makes it easy for people to kill a lot of people in a short amount of time. To me, from an evidentiary standpoint, we're still trying to, the piece from a public health perspective that makes these weapons so dangerous is the high capacity magazines in the type of rifle that we have. We're still trying to sort out the evidence on that. From a moral perspective, I think you just have to draw the line at some place. A civilized society draws the line at some place, and I think the AR-15 is on the other side of that line.
I do too. So let's look at, just for 1 minute, because we're going to Q&A, to slide 39. As we wrap up, and your questions can take us anywhere you please. James will wander about. Please don't speechify. Be as concise as you can. But this is a Fox News poll, and it reinforces, Josh, what you've been saying, and David too. This is a poll taken by Fox, in 2023, April 21 to 24, registered voters, is it okay to have background checks? 87% yes. Should we enforce existing gun laws? 81% yes.
81% buying into the NRA's talking points?
Careful. Now you're sniggering. You can't snigger. You outlawed sniggering. You said that was unusually dangerous audience response. Legal age 21 to buy all guns, 81%. Require mental health checks, 80%. Again, it depends on how these are, asked and so on, but red flag people of danger to self, 80%, and require a 30-day waiting period. That's a whopping waiting period. Your rage will be gone by then, presumably, 77%. That's a pretty interesting poll, if accurate.
All the polling that we do at our center has similar results.
And that's Fox, so it's not as if, Fox has a point of view. Now, they may have had a perfectly objective poll, but they have a point of view that's at some odds with some of these propositions. So, fascinating. All right, so we've only touched the surface of all of this, and I so want to thank our two great speakers here. And we're going to do as many questions as we can get to. But I just want to say that I hope you agree that this program has clarified this incredibly complex issue, that you know more than you knew coming in, and that you've had some really interesting perspectives, and that these are trustworthy individuals, and that this is the sort of thing we need on a range of public issues. I hope you agree with that, because that's why we do this. So it's not unanimous.
Not John Oliver level.
Not John Oliver level. But you really put a damper on it with that sniggering thing. But all right, so James, let's do questions. Raise your hand. James will get to you. We'll keep them brief. You can ask one or both people. Here's one.
We'll start right here, and what I'll say is, please speak directly into the microphone. That's for the benefit of the audience here and also the recording, because if you talk out here, nothing happens.
What?
Yeah. Yes. And then stand if you're able. We would appreciate that. Ready to get started? Let's do it.
So I'll try not to speechify.
Good.
But I mean, we've had 360 mass shootings in this country this year. And in Canada, where they have highly regulated guns, they've had 2. So taking away, or having sensible gun laws, it will eliminate a lot of murders, but I don't think it's going to happen. The other thing is the AR-15 is a military weapon. Why are ordinary citizens allowed, not that you can answer this, but why are ordinary citizens allowed to own a military weapon that is precisely designed to shoot many people all at once, and they blow children apart into 100 pieces? And it's just insane. I don't understand that. So I don't know if that's a question.
I think that was essentially a comment, but I mean, if you want to weigh in on that, we've sort of covered some of that.
I mean, I think I would speak maybe more for people who are more bought into the AR-15, but I think there's, the question of distinguishing what's a military weapon and what's a civilian weapon can be pretty challenging. The traditional woodstock hunting rifle bolt action that everybody thinks is fine and dandy is actually emerges from this complex mixture of military and civilian use. I mean, the lever action rifle that you could load on Sunday and shoot all week was the assault weapon of its day, and people thought that it was crazy, and I guess some people might still think it's crazy. And so this is where I think like the dismissal of the slippery slope argument maybe comes too quickly, because a group like Brady, who now advocates against assault weapons, began as Handgun Control Inc., advocating for outlawing handguns, and they were successful in a couple of places. So when people hear, hell yes, we want to take your AR-15s, it's not irrational for them to also think, well, the Glock was developed for military and police use, so how do we defend ownership of Glocks? And so, I think it's really a complex issue. and that merely saying it's a military weapon, civilians shouldn't have it, is maybe a little too simple. It may be more, I think, well, as Joshua was suggesting, it's more of a moral issue in the country as to whether we think civilians should have this type of weapon.
And may I just say what type, I just want to be real quick about this. So what makes an AR-15 lethal is short barrel rifle, center fire cartridge, so it's a powerful cartridge, the ability to accept a detachable magazine in a pistol stock or a pistol grip. So what you do is you have it's not the most powerful cartridge, it's a relatively powerful cartridge, but it puts it in a package where you have something that's no muzzle creep in that, so you can keep the barrel round after round. Even inexperienced shooters can do that. So you take the technology that was designed for military use for those purposes and you put them in civilian hands. That doesn't mean there's not a more powerful round, there are more powerful rounds, but sort of the combination of all of those things make that weapon extremely lethal.
Back here.
Hi. I just want to follow up with you with the AR-15. I think we assume that AR means assault rifle, and that's not the case. And the AR-15 is a semi-automatic rifle. It is not a machine gun, so you do have to change the cartridges. But it can be modified with the bump stock that they did in, was it the Las Vegas shooting? But I think the use of AR-15 really makes us think it's an assault rifle. And I think it sort of stirs us all up that we're out there with assault rifles. As you said, there's lots more after the AR-15 that has been developed, which is much more harmful and used with the military and other people.
So what does AR stand for?
It stands for Arma Life. It's the company that formed that built the rifle. The man that invented it was a man named Mr. Stoner, and it was sold to this company, Arma Light.
Thank you. Other questions? There's several. Here's one up here, there's one over here, one back there. We'll get to them.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the panel to comment on gun buyback programs. It seems like when those are proposed or adopted, generally they're adopted maybe at a municipal level, and then you'll have a state legislature that will counteract them. Can you talk about why, what is the legal basis for those being unlawful under the Second Amendment? Why isn't it just a matter of the market? You know, there's a buyer and a willing seller to get guns out of circulation.
James, there's one up here, and then over here too. So go ahead.
Do you want to answer that?
I was just going to say, I don't know that voluntary gun buybacks are illegal. I don't think the evidence suggests that they're very effective in reducing crime, but I don't have any issue with them. If somebody has a firearm that they don't want to have in their home, however they got it, if they want to turn it into the police or an organization that will destroy that firearm, you know, I think that's perfectly legal, and it happens pretty routinely.
Yeah, there's no litigation I know that's found them unconstitutional. At the community level, though, there's not a lot of evidence that shows that they reduce violence or gun death or anything like that. I will say I've seen them effective as a community building tool, so people can come together and learn from each other and create, you know, some community around stopping gun violence. But sort of the evidence certainly isn't there in the United States on the small community level of them being effective as a gun violence prevention strategy.
But I do think that some extreme gun advocates resent these programs because they believe then the state or the municipality is making its politics known of wanting to take guns off the street, and they don't want the state involved in this at all.
They may not like it, but
it's legal, but it's upsetting to some. Yes.
It's clear that 80% of the country wants some sort of gun reform. Where does a gun show and the gun show loophole fit into that when there's no background checks? There's free exchange of weapons with anybody buying with cash. What happens to that now and in the future?
Gun show and gun show loophole.
Well, what you're referring to is the fact that the people who are not federally licensed firearms dealers don't have to do background checks. And so it's sort of colloquially known as a gun show loophole, but it can also happen in a McDonald's parking lot or over the, you know, people find each other on, Arms Trader and things like that. In the Safer Communities Act, there is a tightening of the requirements for who is a federally licensed dealer, which means that more people will have to become a federally licensed dealer, or that they will be prosecuted for selling guns without a license. That's how and there are prosecutions are going up slowly because of the Safer Communities Act. But my remedy for that is actually, I'm glad that the administration did that, the Safer Communities Act did that, but we should just have background checks on all gun sales, with some exceptions for transfers between family members, but we should just have, remember I talked about permit to purchase licensing. The sort of floor, the basement of that program is an adequate background check. You can't have a permit to purchase without a background check, and so together that's how you get the effect that we see in our studies. So I think we should just have universal background checks for almost all gun sales, and so that would change that.
And just to sound a more hopeful note, because we have focused maybe a little bit on some of the frustrations, but I think Josh and I, gun owners and non-owners, can agree on a lot of things. And, one of the things that would be great is if we could have private background checks that didn't run through federal firearms licensees, so that people could legally sell firearms with a background check, but to protect the privacy of the data. So one suggestion has been made is to use the blockchain to allow people to generate a code that's connected to the NICS system. I give that code to you, you input it, you can get a green light, and then you can privately transfer your firearm to me, under that system. One of the challenges is the process of having to go through an FFL, where some places those are abundant, some places they're not, some places they charge a lot of money for the transfer, some places they don't. So, I think there's hope for using technology to make some of these things better that we all agree on. We don't want dangerous people to have firearms.
Yeah, I would just like to ask the panel a simple question. Are you for or against being able to carry an AR-15?
In openly in public or?
At all.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you said carrying.
Should you own an AR-15? Should you be allowed to own? They want you to give your actual opinion of that.
I'm going to give you a complex answer, which is, I don't do yes or no.
I would say yes.
You say yes.
You're for what?
Civilian ownership of AR-15s.
Okay, I am for treating them the same way we treat machine guns, which is to put them into the National Firearms Act and make them a Class 3 weapon.
Fair enough.
So I think we saw from the Fox News poll that there's a great deal of unanimity amongst a bunch of these regulations or a bunch of proposed things, like raising the age to buy to 21 and background checks and whatnot. So we don't have a problem of agreement. We have a problem of implementation. And so my question is, why when 80% of the population agrees on something, is it impossible to get it done?
There's sniggering out here.
So I would say it depends where you live. I mean, there are a bunch of states that have done all these things, and those states actually you're starting to see quite a divergence from the states that have not done that. So the states that have done those types of reforms and built on that type of support have the lowest gun death rates right now. You think about places like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Hawaii, but in a state, just again, I want to go back to Tennessee, where we saw very similar poll results to that recently, but you're seeing Republican legislators being very resistant to that because they have gerrymandered their districts so tightly that they are much more afraid of their primary voters, who are probably the 20% who don't agree with that, than they are the general public. So I think that's a big piece of that. So our U.S. Senate's not a majoritarian institution. A lot of our state legislatures actually aren't either. So we have a system where if you have 80%, but you have legislators who are not necessarily pressured by that group, then that's a problem. So it goes back to redistricting and the way we look at gerrymandering and all those complicated, and even the Electoral College. So these are complicated issues, but that's part of the problem as well.
And we do have a system that's designed to protect minority persons and views. So, when I think about a majority of people support X policy, therefore that should be the law of the land, I think about the history of support of anti-miscegenation laws, right? Interracial marriage. I wouldn't want myself, my wife, my daughter to live in a place where the majority of the population thinks that abortion should be banned, for example. We don't have a system where we mechanically translate public opinion polls into policy.
But then what you're saying, I think, is that the Bill of Rights is meant to protect minority rights, and so majoritarianism does not answer. So in a time of war, if 92% of the American people wanted to shut down the nation's newspapers, the courts presumably would protect them under the First Amendment. So that if you're going to make the argument that 80-some% of the American people want to do X or Y or Z with respect to guns, and the politicians won't do it, then their argument has to be that the Second Amendment trumps that majoritarianism, right? They can't argue just from the point of view that we don't want to do it. Otherwise, they'd have to be responsive. They have to say there's a reason not to do it to protect the Second Amendment's guarantee, right? And so that's where the Second Amendment becomes so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Bill of Rights is to protect things that maybe in the minority viewpoints, right?
Exactly.
So the question of what is protected by the Second Amendment becomes extremely important.
Right. And it's amazing that you said it wasn't until a few years ago,
2008,
that the court first really weighed in a big way on this. This has been a kind of a silent part of the Constitution.
It was kind of taken for granted that but many years of planning. This is where I think the gun lobby did a good job. Many years of planning and scholarly articles and making the NRA professorships and things like that. All of a sudden there was this body of law, and when the courts changed, there was something that they could sort of rely on to hang their hat on. And so we are now busily creating the other side of that.
Hoping to, yeah.
There's a book recommended on the Vail Symposium website called Gunfight. If you want to know this history, it's beautiful.
Visit the bookworm to pick that up.
7:46, we have 14 minutes.
Thank you, Clay. Good to see you. This is partial statement and partial question. During the 20s and 30s, there was a big slaughter, typical what we're having now with humans, of ducks and geese in this country. And the federal government passed a law that you could only have 3 shotgun shells in your shotgun. And if you get caught with more than that, they can take away your gun, fine you $1,000, $2,000. So are you both aware of that?
Oh, there's lots of regulation on how many rounds you can have, what type of...
We think more of saving our ducks and geese than we do our children.
Conserving them. Fair enough. There's a couple more. They're all over here.
We've got one right here.
I have a question if you've noticed or observed the change, if there is a change in the attitudes of the young people as they're going through active shooter training in school, which is nothing we had. Is that having any effect in terms of what they think? And might we see a change in their behavior in voting or anything in the future?
Good question.
Yeah, well, I can say I teach college. I've been teaching college for decades now, and I teach every year a course called Sociology of Guns, and so we take up these issues. And for the first time last fall, I saw that what my students were really a mass shooting generation. If you think about in 2012, Sandy Hook, they were late elementary school to middle school. Parkland, they're in high school. Uvalde, they're in college. And so their experiences and their understanding of gun control is really profoundly shaped by this. And I think they have a very activist orientation, to really wanting to do something. I don't know that they know what exactly needs to be done, But I think that we are going to see a generation of people who are profoundly shaped by that. And when people say Sandy Hook happened and nobody did anything, things happened, right? The gun violence prevention movement got more active. Grassroots organizations got more active, and students, the next generation has been shaped by this. So, there can be change down the road for sure.
As we run out of time here, I just want to say a couple things. First of all, stick around afterwards. Our speakers will be here if you want to talk with them or ask a question that you didn't get recognized for. We won't stay forever, but we'll stay for a while. Come tomorrow night to the talk about Native American issues and history and where things are. So we hope that, and we'll have our next of the series in January, and it will be on banned books in America. So that should be fun. And so, you're welcome to come back. But let's take just a couple more here.
Right here in the aisle.
I have a concealed carry permit here, and one of the items up there was we need more good guys with guns, and it really should be we need more well-trained good guys with guns. The question I want to ask is, do you know of any mass shooting or maybe semi-mass shooting that was carried out by somebody who had a permit?
Yeah, there's actually a group that follows and tracks that. They're called the Violence Policy Center. You can go to their website and see all the shootings that have taken place by someone with a concealed carry permit. But I think to David's point, these are people who have background checks and almost very similar to like a license to have this. So, I think in general, those folks are not more violent than anybody else. But there are definitely instances of it's tracked where concealed people with permits have committed crimes and crimes of mass violence.
Well, my reason for asking that is that every month in some of the magazines, concealed carry magazines, there's at least 3, 4, or 5 instances described where a quote good guy or good gal with a gun defused something or killed somebody that was breaking in, and the police can't respond.
Right. So you have to weigh, it's public health. You have to weigh the risks, right? So 3 or 4 a week, 3 or 4 a month. You have to think about what it means to bring a gun into your home at the same time. What we're trying to do is put data out there about the risks, about the rate of gun violence. Bringing a gun into your home or carrying a gun is a big responsibility, and thinking about it, from that standpoint is important. Is it a risk you think is beneficial to you and your family? I know the decision I've made for my family. And yes, there are people who will use guns in self-defense. Of course there is. But there's also, there's almost 50,000 people who are going to die by gun violence every year. So it's just, guns are used. It's a complex issue. We started that at the beginning, and I think that's a good example of that. But there's, fewer stories like that than gun deaths, and you just have to weigh, what are my chances of using a gun in self-defense, and what are the issues about bringing a gun into my community? Might it get stolen? Might someone in my home have access to it and die by suicide? I mean, these are all really complex issues, but the way the Supreme Court has set that up, having a gun in your home now is your choice, and you have to think through it clearly and rationally.
I don't carry here in Vail. I think there's a bigger liability to carry than not to carry. Just so I'm not carrying.
All right, so thank you very much.
As I make my way to the other side of the room, I received a question via email from someone who couldn't be here this evening. And I like to think about this as a Thanksgiving dinner table question. Are there talking points that are effective in engaging in conversation with people who hold extreme positions on either side?
So how do you have a conversation with people who hold extreme positions that will become a productive conversation?
I mean, my approach is, always to try to start with what we hold in common. You know, instead of using, again, some of the talking points that I think both sides use that drive people apart, is to begin your conversation with points of agreement. You know, what do we see as the problem that we're trying to address, and then, you know, work from there. But then also to realize that having civic grace doesn't mean that you're going to come to an agreement at the end of the day. You know, we will disagree on certain things at the end of the day, but we respect each other as fellow citizens in having these disagreements. So, but you know, start with what you have in common rather than what divides you.
I'm a Socrates. Tell me more. Tell me more. Tell me more. Because people, if you draw them out, they often reach their own cul-de-sac, or and then they think, well, okay, So anyway, we got one right behind you.
One of the things I've learned in life is when you don't understand why things are happening, you should look for the money. And this whole issue of gun reform, you've got lots of money by the gun manufacturers and the NRA and other, not only just, and they're buying politicians. What's your views about, maybe that's another First Amendment problem, but it just seems to me there's a great flow of money supporting the universal access to guns.
And James, right behind you there too. Gentlemen, follow the money.
You know, the strength of the NRA comes from the activism of its members, and it's succeeded over time in politically activating gun owners, and even some have argued creating gun owner as an identity. And so, you know, we have issues in our political system with the influence of money, you know, big pharma, big business, big alcohol. The NRA is pretty small in terms of its monetary influence relative to the U.S. interest group system, but it's not small in how active its members are. And, you know, it's easier to activate people for something than to activate them against something. And I think, you know, Josh has been, you know, in the trenches fighting to figure out ways to activate people for, you know, gun violence prevention, and even that changing of the language. It's not like anti-gun. We're not against guns or for gun control. We're for doing something positive.
And as we go to the last or second to last question, can we put up 38, please? Go ahead, James.
So you mentioned the possible solution of moving the AR-15 to a Class 3 weapon. Mm-hmm. I find that really interesting. Get rid of the AR-15, get rid of the AR-15. The issue I think it comes down to is the AR-15 sits at the intersection on that lethality spectrum, where it possesses many characteristics that individual characteristics that we do find acceptable, be it caliber, be it center fire, be it the length of the barrel. And yet combined, it seems to sort of move it over that line in some people's opinions. So my question to you is, how do we move the AR-15 to that Class 3 weapon, or make it illegal without dragging along a wide swath of other rifles and firearms that actually are acceptable, because we have to define the characteristics that we're making illegal?
That's why I was careful to define. It's not just the AR-15. It's, you know, AK-47 types of weapons as well. And they are semi-automatic weapons, to be clear, but they are center fire rifle cartridges, ability to accept a detachable magazine, short-barreled rifle, and a pistol grip. Those are the characteristics that I would find to be objectionable. Yep. When they're combined. Yep.
But his concern is, you know, mix and match.
Right, but I mean, laws are always, you know, you always have to draw a line at some point, and so those are the characteristics that, you know, I would say is where the line needs to be drawn.
Last question for tonight, and you can stay and ask more, of course.
Kind of following up on this gentleman, it's not so much a question as a statement, but I hate these AR-15 assault rifles, the lethality of them, but there's 20 million of these guns in circulation, and banning them is going to be no simple thing. Even if 99% of these people give up their guns willingly,
there's going to be thousands of people that are going to be hiding in the hollers and fiercely fighting back. You're going to see a Waco and a Ruby Ridge every single day if something like that comes about. So it's just, I think it's impractical myself.
So I want to say something about that. So I'm the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. When I'm talking about AR-15s, you know, this is a personal view of mine, so I want to be clear about that, and that the evidence, that may or may not be true, but the evidence for things like permit to purchase is stronger about saving lives. So we're spending a lot of time talking about assault weapons, and that's fine, but I also want to make sure that we remember there are other things that with a strong evidence base, which is why when I said my top 5, I didn't include that from our center, because we look at the evidence base and we really think, starting with the 5 things we mentioned, we would save more lives. I morally, personally, Josh Horwitz personally objects to selling AR-15 or I would think we can regulate them the way that we've regulated machine guns, but we talk a lot about these things, but I want people to focus on pieces that actually are more popular among most Americans that will save, that it seemed to be, our evidence shows, will save more lives. And so I just want to bring that back because we're already spending a lot of time on this. And I want to say, you know, I've talked about it, but that's my opinion. Our center is really focused on the policies that I mentioned.
All right, so alas, we're out of time. Do stick around, and if you think we have missed the mark in any way or this has not been the right approach to this, you know, come up and see me or talk to James or especially Dale. But both of you as we go. So Josh, you know, our committee said, show me where to put the lever and I will move the world. Let's say you get one and only one of your 5 that would be accepted for the nation of the United States. If you only get one, which one do you want?
Require licensing to purchase a firearm.
I think that a lot of gun trauma exists in our least privileged communities, and so I like community violence intervention programs.
James, take it away.
How about Josh Horwitz, David Yamane, and Clay Jenkinson? Gentlemen, thank you so much for leading us through that topic.